We've been very busy in the state, unfortunately, due to disasters that have come in. The dollar loss and damages right now are estimated between public and private property losses in the state of Minnesota is about $845 million, and they're still assessing the cost of those damages right now. It's been a major event that has tasked the entire state, all the resources of state agencies, not only emergency management, along with private industry that have been pulling together to try to, I guess, heal the state and bring everybody back together. I guess I'd like to keep it a little bit informal tonight and try to answer some specific questions you may have, and I'll try and tailor it kind of towards the fire protection, building and codes, and some of the issues that we had to face there along those lines. And we'll kind of give you an overview of kind of what's happened in the state. We can take some questions, and if time permits, there's a short 10-minute video of the downtown East Grand Forks area. And it is hard to put in perspective what really happened there. But when you had 2,300 homes, and you had 8 that did not sustain water damage in the entire community. And we're looking at somewhere of about 600 homes right now. They're getting ready to start tearing down and haul into a landfill because they are unsalvageable. There's substantial damage to those structures. And there's many issues right now dealing with floodplain and whether they can rebuild or they can't rebuild. And the direction we're getting from FEMA right now is they want to reassess the floodplain and that entire Red River Valley area and basically reestablish where the 100-year floodplain is going to be, which is going to have a substantial impact on many of the towns and communities. Because they're indicating that we have towns that are 2 miles away from the river that are going to be in the new floodplain, and because they were flooded. We have the Minnesota River in that part of the state, if you're not aware, runs north versus everything else that runs south in the state, and it presents a very unique challenge in that when the snow starts to melt, it has to flow north. Well, the river is unthawing from south to north versus everywhere else in the state. It's already unthawed as we get the snowpack to melt and it can flow. Up in that part of the state, it cannot do that. It hits the ice jams and it can't go anywhere, so it begins to pool and puddle and keeps getting larger and larger and larger up in that part of the state, which is really a unique thing. It took about a month and a half to convince FEMA that the river runs the other direction. And a couple of their inspectors, we had to take and throw popcorn in the river and say it goes north, not south. They had a hard time figuring that one out. But we'll kind of go through some slides and some information about that particular area of the state and kind of put everything in perspective as to what we had to deal with throughout the community and area up there. One of the things that we have to think about in this natural disaster that tasked the state and these communities so much is this started back in December. We started with ice storms and blizzards and had the first time in the history of the state we've ever been declared for snow declaration for natural disaster. Minnesota normally does not get declarations for snow. We in fact didn't think that we had an opportunity to do that. We applied for it and we were kind of surprised that we pushed some buttons because several other states had been declared for snow removal, and we were able to get that additional assistance, which brought in about $12 to $14 million into the state to try and reimburse local units of government for the additional cost of snow removal based on 2 of the big storms that we had. One of the issues that we ran into twice this year was actually late in '96. We had an ice storm, and basically ice storms out in the greater part of the state of Minnesota does exactly what you see to the power lines, brings them all to the ground. We had the same thing that happened again, and it repeated itself in the first part of April. And we had several parts of the state that were in the process of fighting the flood and trying to control that. They hit with the ice storm and lost power. There was 8 of Minnesota was without power for 4 weeks before any power could be reestablished. Several areas of the state were impacted this way. One of the national moves that is out there on the federal level is to eliminate the ability to be reimbursed for damage to rural co-ops and electrical. We've had, I think, about $45 million worth of damage to rural co-ops electrical lines. And if the federal government moves ahead on their plan and exempts that as being reimbursable expenditures, it's going to force that expenditure back onto the state, back onto local units of government, into the co-ops. It's going to have a dramatic effect on electrical rates throughout the entire state of Minnesota.
Are the cities exempt?
They're
going to exempt the rural. Are they going to exempt the cities?
Right now, they were not exempting the municipal. They're going to exempt the private co-ops. And the other thing that's in the bill that's coming in at the federal level is to exempt trees from any of the recoverable costs. So if you have tornadoes or those things that come through, you can't be reimbursed for the clearance and removal of the trees. And the other thing that they're dealing with on floods and those kind of things is the vegetation. They will not allow you to reseed and include that as part of the cost for shrubs and trees. And one of the big problems we have with that, and during some of the flooding and then the spring rains that we had in the southern part of the state in Mankato, several of the road banks washed down. Large sections of it came down, blocked all the roadways off. You had to haul all the debris back and process of rebuilding those landsides again, but they won't include the reimbursement for the trees or the shrubbery, which you need to try to hold the soil in place. They'll pay you to put all the dirt back up on the hill, but not to keep it there. And those are some real big issues that we're trying to work with on a national level now that's going to have direct impact back into the state, back to the local unit of government. It's basically passing the cost of the disasters back to the states and the local units of government, because the cost of those disasters are getting so high right now. As we got into the flooding, and maybe I had to back up one step prior to getting into the flooding, we had 2 open declarations that we were basically, our staff was very busy on and trying to get grants out to local units of government as we came into the flooding. It's a budget year for us. We had a lot of legislative initiatives that were there. We were busy with the legislature, dealing with our emergency management budget. We were also assigned the task as the lead agency for the 1837 spear fishing rights, and we're the coordination point for all the local units of government in the counties that were affected by that as we came into the flood. The flooding we knew was going to be bad, and preparation started back in January. We started meeting with agencies and jurisdictions, and they started to develop plans and strategies on how they're going to try to protect communities. As many of these communities were in the middle of building their protection, and a good example, City of East Grand Forks, we got a blizzard that dropped 14 inches of snow and about an inch of rain and dropped them to sub-zero temperatures for an extended period of time. It really hampered the fighting effects for everybody that was out there dealing with the flood. These are basically the people that you see putting barricades up are trying to barricade a road because of the floodwaters. And that's the kind of conditions that they had to deal with in that part of the state this spring with the heavy snows that came in right in the middle of the flood activity in many areas of the state. The sub-zero temperatures threw a new twist in the flooding that we've never had to deal with before. This is a picture here right out of the downtown area of the city of Ada that flooded and then it froze. And that ice froze to be between 8 and 10 inches thick. It was that cold. One of the unique things that we ran into, particularly in the city of Ada, everything was underwater. Ada is 2 miles from the river. Ada was flooded from the melting snow traveling over land trying to get to the river. The flood in one sense saved some of the communities because it stopped and slowed down the runoff dramatically and then kind of let it slowly start back up again. The city of Ada, it brought down their electrical. They were hit with that same amount of snow. They tried to go to get their snow plows and they were froze down in the ground. Their trucks were flooded out of the public works garage. They were basically left paralyzed with unable to respond to anything. And that triggered a lot of National Guard assistance and other resources that were brought in to try and protect that community. Talk a little bit about East Grand Forks. The East Grand Forks area has gotten the majority of the attention nationally because that was the highest population area that was affected throughout the state. Population of East Grand Forks is about 8,500 people, single family, multiple family residents. One of these unique, there's a very distinct, almost a historical downtown area. Business district, very traditional business district in that area, built generally along the river, which had a big impact on the town when we got into the flooding. There's a lot of individual subdivisions and a lot of cohesiveness of the community, that they have a lot of pride in their individual communities, which actually help bring them together. They're historical buildings, a lot of commercial and industrial property within that community. The area in and around that town is flat. I don't know how else to describe that. 2 analogies have been used. One is it's basically like taking your dining room table and putting a scratch down the middle of it, and that's the Red River. And another analogy was that basically the slope from East Grand Forks to the Canadian border would be the equivalent of taking a sheet of plywood and putting it level and putting 3 single sheets of newspaper paper under one edge of it, and that's basically the slope that we have up there. For most intents purposes, the area is completely flat. So when you get a mass amount of water that gets freed up from a large snowfall that we had over the winter, they had about 14 inches of snow in that particular area of the state. The water had nowhere to go, and it just began to build up and build up. And the city of East Grand Forks, the Red Lake River comes in and meets with the Red River. And there's kind of a Y-shaped area that is a large, newer subdivision that's in the middle of that very nice, beautiful area. But we have basically 2 rivers that come together. At the height of the flood, both rivers, their crests came at almost exactly the same time, which had a big impact on the community in the area. The flood stage in that town is 27 feet. At 27 feet, they have to take protective actions over and above what's in place right now. The river crested at 54 feet. So we have a substantial amount of water over what is considered to be their flood states in that particular part of the state. Preparation went on and really began to build the dikes, sandbagging, building up the walls, started in January with the plans and the procedures. The community of East Grand Forks went out and they actually bought a golf course to dig the clay out of it, to build dikes. When we started to get into the heat of the battle, about the 2 weeks before the flooding actually occurred because of the blizzard and the other things, they actually went into the schools and dug up the playgrounds and the football fields and the ball fields, trying to get clay. Good, solid clay material for building the dikes. And there are some cases where they went and dug up gravel roads in the country and tried to move them. At facilities, they basically dug the yards up and tried to build berms and things around them, trying to protect them. So it's almost hard to imagine the amount of activity that went into the actual preparation and trying to protect the community from the overall flooding. Sandbagging went on all across the state for an extended period of time. And I'll have to give a lot of credit to the volunteers and the people that came out to do that. That is a civilian activity in the state of Minnesota. The National Guard does not sandbag. That's a civilian activity that takes place, and there's literally hundreds and thousands of volunteers that came out to do that particular activity. The city of East Grand Forks, I got there about 8 hours before the levees had gave way. The town was shut down. There was no school, every business was closed, everybody was sandbagging. Everybody was out there trying to protect the community. They were hauling sandbags in the back of cars, on dump trucks, on loaders. I mean, it was a total community effort that everybody was out there, had been out there for several days in that mode of operation. On Friday the 18th, as we was mentioning, everybody was out sandbagging, the entire town was closed. The previous predictions for the river height was at 50 feet. That's where they were building to from early in January, that it was estimated that we'd have a 50-foot crest in that particular area. And about that time, we got the information from the National Weather Service and the Army Corps of Engineers that it was going to be 52 feet. And it became a big issue there of, are we going to pull back and evacuate, or are we going to try to add 2 more feet onto the levee? The only problem that you get with trying to extend the levees at this point is your foundation is not wide enough and engineered. It was engineered for 50 feet. And you can't just vertically stack 2 more feet on the top and hold back the amount of water that's behind on that river. So that was a challenge that they were faced with on that evening. There was no freeboard on the dikes. When I was in town, I got up in the center part of town after I checked in at the city's EOC. I decided to walk out to see how bad it was by the river. And I walked down, I was about 2.5 blocks away. I'll never forget the picture of looking up and almost as high as I could see, and it was about 27 feet tall, sandbag wall that was there. And I looked at that and I thought, geez, how high is that water? There was still so much snow in town, the snow banks were higher than the buildings. I climbed up on top of the big snow bank, and that water was lapping at the very top of those sandbags. There was literally no freeboard, no room for that river to grow, and that's when they just got word it was going to go up 2 more feet. Standing on the ground, that water was probably 27 feet above my head, looking at that. And that was pretty awesome to sit there and look at that and think what could happen if that starts to give way, which eventually is what had happened in that particular area. The city of Grand Forks on the other side of the river started to pull their people off the dikes. Their dikes started to become unstable. They were blowing their sirens and pulling everybody off the levees and the dikes, which in a sense gave the Minnesota side an extra gasp of air, because they said if it fails on that side, it's going to relieve a lot of the water pressure. It's going to go out the other way. And it's going to bring it down. So that kind of re-inspired some of the folks there to begin trying to add to the levee system. So the process there was that they decided to add to that. Because it was in an emergency stage, we brought in about 1,000 troops from the National Guard. They were assisting in that sandbag operation and protecting that particular area. Early on Saturday morning, the dikes were declared unsafe. The National Guard had people that were walking and monitoring the dikes, and they started to pulsate with the river. The entire wall started to move with the river banks. We pulled everybody out of there, started evacuating the entire area. The sirens were sounding. Basically, everybody was trying to get out. At this point, the area that they called the point by the other river, the Red Lake River, had broken open, and that area had started to flood. And as soon as it started to flood, the flood had cut off any exit for vehicles out of that area. So within about a 1-hour time frame, basically the water was about 5 to 6 feet deep through that entire subdivision. And we're talking an area of about 800 to 900 homes in that particular area, with all the people and stuff basically still trapped into there. And we had to go into extensive rescue operations at that time. At the same time that was failing, the decision was made to try to save the center core of town. center core, the business district, is a little higher elevation than the rest of the town, so they went in and started to build a ring dike around the inside of town, basically tearing the streets up, pushing them up, bringing clay in, and trying to build a berm around that particular area. When the dikes start to overflow, it's kind of a graphic picture to show, but this is basically the line of the dike and the water coming over it, and it's about a little bit higher than the eave height on the garage here. So that's the volume of water that just started to pour over, and eventually a lot of those dikes just opened up and let the water come in very quickly. And some of the areas that came in relatively slowly and built up over a period of time, and then some of them that opened up very quickly. Early Saturday morning, the point area was cut off, led to helicopter operations. We had to evacuate 600 people roughly from East Grand Forks under a helicopter. It was our only access. The water had filled up there so deep that we can no longer get National Guard trucks in there, and they'll go through about 9 feet of water. And we could no longer get the trucks in and out of that area. The trucks started to float off the roads, so we couldn't effect the evacuation that way. It turned to basically all air and boat operations, and boat was very tricky because of the currents that we had. There was a tremendous amount of current going through the town, and you kind of have to envision, I guess one of the colonels from the National Guard said it would be like a clip out of Apocalypse Now. Basically, you had helicopters that were flying about 100 feet off the ground at night, searchlights on, making pickups and going about 6 blocks and dropping people at an evacuation center. And they're just back and forth and constant. That went on for about 14 hours straight of helicopter evacuations. We had landing zones in the neighborhoods. When those got flooded, it came to picking people up off of cars and roofs of houses and those kind of things. It was the only opportunity we had to get the folks out of that area. The city EOC was in the downtown area, and the decision was made to evacuate that in case the center core area or dike would not survive the incoming water. Shortly into about daylight in the morning on the following Saturday morning, we had the center core dike started failing. The water was coming up too fast. They couldn't build the dike fast enough. It started coming in. Focus then turned to try to protect, again, continue the evacuation and to protect the police and fire station. Sandbagging started at the police and fire station, saying we already lost one fire station in town that was down in the point area, and we're trying to protect the center one. They pulled some of the equipment out. Most of the equipment was sandbagged in that particular area because once they started to build a ring dike, they wanted to keep equipment in there for fire protection. But now when the ring dike started to fail, we couldn't get the trucks out of the town anymore, the ones that were left in there, so we tried to sandbag the station to protect the trucks. Helicopter evacuations continued. We brought in what we call a Minix overhead team. That's from the DNR and U.S. Forest Service. It's a management team that brings in a management team to come in and help the community manage the entire incident. It brings in planning people and logistics people, finance people, operations people, and some command or coordination level people to try to help the community pull itself back together. One of the big challenges that we had here is these people had probably not been to bed for 3 days prior to when the levees broke. They had been trying to fight this thing 24 hours a day, and it had been gotten very intense, and a lot of them had not been to bed literally for 3 days, and they needed to go home. They needed to take care of the families, because one of the other issues we had here is all the employees' homes were lost, their families were displaced, they had to find places for them. They didn't know where their next meal was going to come from. So it became a big issue of trying to get the employees out, to find their families, find out where they were evacuated to, and get them linked back together with those folks. The helicopter landings were being lost on the vehicles. We later at the reception center, because the water started coming up at the technical college area, we lost the landing zones there where the helicopters were landing to transfer the people to get them onto the buses. We had to go literally out in the country onto a road, drop people by helicopter there, have the buses meet them, and then we had to bus them into Crookston at the evacuation shelter because there wasn't anything there. The sandbagging failed at the fire stations. At the other fire station, focus really turned to the police station, which was the 911 answering point for the community, and the police dispatch center was there. It's a facility that was only a year and a half old, about a $2 million facility, and a water treatment plant. Those were the two main priorities at this point that we had in the community, because generally everything else was lost. The police station stayed dry. We put about 150 National Guard troops on that building. They cemented the floor drain shut. They built a 6-foot wall around it, and they kept it dry. And, same thing with the water treatment plant. They built a dike all the way around the water treatment plant with sandbags to keep the water treatment plant from being destroyed, which later proved to be critical in restoring some of the infrastructure and allowing us to get the water back up 3 weeks after the disaster had occurred. Most of the city staff at this time had left. The entire community The evacuations were still going on, and we basically used every mode of evacuation that we could do, from National Guard trucks to loaders that were hauling people, hauling sandbags in, hauling people back out. Got involved with a lot of air operations, and we're happy to basically say that throughout the entire evacuation there was no serious injuries. Basically across the entire state. There's been 6 deaths that have been associated with the flood. All those deaths, the common link to those were that people were driving in vehicles and encountered moving water. In 1 or 2 cases, they suspect that the people didn't see the water and drove into it. In a couple other places, the people thought they could get through where the water was coming over the road, and the current basically picked the vehicles up and swept them away. And so that was where we are going to be focusing a lot of education in the spring if we're faced with the same type of flooding, and so people understand the hazards of trying to drive through those flooded areas. My hat goes off to the National Guard for the efforts that they did in trying to control that community and evacuate the people out of there and start restoring the infrastructure. The main mode of transportation became boat. For about 8 days in the downtown area of East Grand Forks, the only mode of operation was by boat. There was no truck access or anything else. The town literally became water world. This sign appeared about 1 mile out of town, and basically everything was underwater. When you got to the city limits, that's where the water was. And from there on, everything that you saw was underwater and was floating out in the streets. There was no access in that particular area. Assessing the impact of this disaster became a challenge, to say the least. It was very difficult to try to ascertain how much infrastructure damage there was going to be once the water receded. And that was going to be critical in trying to restore the gas, the electricity, the sewer and water back to the community. Those are the first elements that we needed to focus on, and we were trying to do that. This picture basically looks at the Grand Forks side over East Grand Forks, and these are the bridges that link the community. This is basically how wide the river normally is. During the flooding, the river was mapped out at 21 miles wide from shore to shore of the river. So a river that was a few hundred feet wide was 21 miles wide during the height of the flooding. It affected not only the downtown area, but the rural areas. There's many areas that were basically islands that were out there. This is one that is actually not flooded too bad because most of the structures are still up and out of that. When we take a look at the impact of the entire state, every county that is shaded here has been declared a disaster. The difference in the light to the dark is these were just public assistance. This was public and private assistance. And I believe this was just private assistance under another disaster, or public assistance under another disaster. So we had multiple counties that were affected through that flooding and through that entire region of the state. The impact is really hard to determine when we take a look at how many houses were going to be left. We were faced with issues of trying to determine the housing stock that we're going to need to get people back in. Temporary housing, where we're going to put them, what avenues can be used, how many of the structures are going to be substantially damaged to the point where they can't be repaired. To give you an idea of how deep the snow was up in that part of the state, this is in the later stages of the flood out in the country, but these are the snowbanks that were out there. And just a tremendous amount of snow. It was not uncommon to see the snowbanks and the drifts at 30 feet deep near the tree lines with the amount of snow that was there. There were several areas up in that part of the state that they gave up trying to keep roads open. They just closed them for the winter. They couldn't sustain them and keep them open anymore. We had a lot of competing interests out there. There's a lot of issues in the country versus the city, and competition of one farmer trying to relieve the water pressure on his or her property to protect their property, their farmstead, and then the neighbors would get flooded. So there became a lot of controversy out in the countryside with farmers going out and trying to tear roads apart to relieve water pressure to protect some of their property, but it would flood somebody else's. And eventually throughout most of that area, the water pressure took out all the county roads. Almost all the gravel roads out there were substantially damaged and gone, and are just now starting to get repaired to the point where they're basically passable at this particular time. You look at the downtown areas, you basically see in this particular shot here, the water level is almost at the main floor. One of the things that's unique with FEMA and flood insurance is they don't insure anything in the basement. If you're in a floodplain, you have to have flood insurance, but anything in the basement is written off. It's not covered underneath the flood insurance program. And those became big issues when we started to get into recovery and what the people had understood their coverage to be. The depth of the water varied a little bit. Some of the areas that were the older parts of town that were built right down by the river we had roof line, second floor type of water depths down in that area. And some of these photos here is actually after the water has gone down a little bit. We have a couple areas in the town where the houses were completely submerged for about 3 or 4 days. One of the things that we found is that when the water level went down, so did a lot of the structures. They just kind of melted right down with the water when they went down. We found out we had multiple homes that had floated off the foundations. Houses were picked up and turned off the foundations from the amount of times they sat in the water in that particular area. We had some basements that were in the floodplain that were flood-proofed, and it's kind of like having a swimming pool that you leave empty, and you get a lot of water or hydraulic pressure and it pops the swimming pool out of the ground. Well, waterproof basements, the houses popped up like a bottle right out of the ground. The water didn't get in, but there's so much hydraulic pressure that was there, it popped them up. We have one problem in the city of Ada right now because of the depth of the water, and there's so much pressure down in the soils that it took all their PVC storm sewer piping and it's egg-shaped it. It's pushed it all down throughout the entire community. All of it is egg-shaped now. And so they're trying to figure out if they got to replace it all or what they're going to do, but they tried to put cameras in it, and the cameras won't fit down, and it's collapsed down that much throughout the entire community. So there's a lot of infrastructure damage that is still being discovered throughout these particular areas. Many of the roads, this was not an uncommon sight out in the countryside at all. The gravel roads just washed away. There's so much water that was coming overland to get to the river that it just took out all the roads with it along the way. The other thing that we saw that happened in most of the homes is the basements collapsed. Those that it hadn't collapsed in, as the waters went down, we ran into 2 problems. One, people became impatient and wanted to pump their basements out right away. And you need to take about a 6-day process of getting water out of your basements. You want to drop it about a 1/6 every day and let the outside hydraulic pressure equalize. We had some volunteer groups that came into town that were willing to help and brought big pumps in and pumped basements out in an hour or 2. And when the basement's pumped out, within an hour to 2 hours, the walls collapsed in on them. And that happened in many of the houses throughout the entire community that we were faced with that particular problem. Service disruptions became kind of a norm for that particular area of the state. You know, not only do you not have mail service, but you don't have heat, you don't have electricity, you can't pay your bills. When you've been evacuated, if you got your cash machine card and you went to the bank, you couldn't get anything out of it because your bank records were underwater, their electronic systems were underwater. It was amazing how far we went out with the disruption of service. We could not sustain phones for an extended period of time. We ended up going to satellite telephones. We were trying landlines, they were coming and going. Cell phones were overloaded. Some of the towers went down in the flooding. So there were many times that we had no communications other than to go to satellite telephone systems that we had brought in for the flooding. And that became a critical link that we put out into some of these communities so we were guaranteed communications to them and the National Guard and the state capitol. Because there were many of these towns that were basically ring-diked around and they were an island unto themselves. For 7 to 8 days they had no access event that anybody could get there other than by helicopter. And for medical reasons and evacuation purposes, we had set up satellite phones with them in a direct link so we could get air support from the National Guard in there to pull people out for medical conditions or evacuation if it was necessary. And in many of those communities we were fortunate that we didn't have to go to that step. The ring-diking around them did work. One of the other things that we noticed in the service disruptions is built-in fire protection is gone. Water system is down. Water system was down for about 4 weeks before we had city water pressure back up and the system cleaned out again. That was part of the era or the time when we started to experience the fires. The Grand Forks side experienced the worst of the fires in our downtown area. We had on the Minnesota side about 6 single-family homes that started on fire. And basically we just used a National Guard Huey helicopter with a bucket to put water on the exposures so that it wouldn't jump from house to house. It basically burned itself down in the water line and the fire went out. But we were trying to maintain, we didn't want to start spreading from house to house throughout the neighborhoods. The only access that we had was by helicopter. This is a shot of the Grand Forks area and the initial part of the fire in this area here, and that entire area is basically under about 6 to 7 feet of water. And it started to eventually consume the entire block or area before it was put out. Represents some significant challenges for the fire department when they were going in trying to put the fire out. This was basically about as far as they could get in with their pumpers, a little bit farther, and then they started having trouble with the water coming into breathers to the engines on the trucks and displacing the oil. The water was getting into the crankcases and it was displacing the oil and pushing the oil up and out the breathers. And all of a sudden they started noticing oil slicks around their engines as they're out there trying to pump water. and that's where they ran into that particular problem. They had to pull them out. They eventually brought in National Guard flatbeds and put the pumpers on top of the flatbeds. Basically elevated them about 4.5 feet off the ground. Then they drove the flatbeds in, and they had to pump from up on top of flatbeds. They had initially wanted to get their domestic water supply. They didn't make a hydrant hooked up, but they found that their hydrant system was down. They just went basically back to hard suction drafting the river water that was right there. But had a lot of debris and contaminant in there. They had a lot of trouble trying to fight and control the fires. But they ended up putting, I believe, 3 engines, their pumpers up on top of National Guard flatbeds in order to get them in there far enough to control those fires. Being creative kind of became the norm. Communications was a critical issue that we had. What you basically see here is we've got a fire department aerial truck from East Grand Forks that was set up with 2 antennas and repeater towers for communications. And depending on where we had communications problem, we actually just moved the truck. We had radio repeaters built on, we bolted them onto it, and we could put it up 80 feet in the air and create a mobile radio tower to move around where we needed it to try to maintain radio communications throughout that entire area. The people that became a real asset to us was the ham radio or amateur radio operators. They came in and were able to sustain and maintain a network of radios for the entire response, for the community, so the fire department could talk to each other, the police department. The amateur radio people came in and set up the radio networks and provided the equipment to do that.
What did they use for power?
Generators.
What generators?
We had generators that we brought in for electrical power throughout that entire area. National Guard generators and ones from the state and through the DNR Forest Service. We had a lot of generators that were brought in to establish power and to do that. Communications was one of our critical links, and we had to have alternate systems. Every system that we tried and used at one point failed, and we had to go to another one. We felt pretty good that we were able to sustain communications throughout the disaster in that area, but we had a failure in a lot of systems. And so redundancy and backup became real critical, and the reliability on cell phones, that seems to be everybody's answer, but on large-scale disasters, that's one of the first things to go. We're seeing cell phones are going down faster than landline phones are, because they get overloaded. And particularly when you get a lot of media attention that comes into an area, when the media gets there, when they get a cell phone line, they won't hang it back up. They'll keep the link and keep the constant communications there. And that fills your cell towers up, and you run out of room, and you just can't use them. All you get is busy signals on them. One of the things that we did is brought in radio technicians. We had 3 radio technicians that were there to be reprogramming radios and fixing radios and doing all that stuff throughout the disaster, which really became a key. We had law enforcement and fire service people that came in from all over the country to provide additional support and patrols. As they came into town, their radios needed to be reprogrammed at the frequencies that the local jurisdictions had, so we were constantly programming and reprogramming radios throughout the event. Planning ahead really became a major issue once the city of East Grand Forks had been devastated, that the town was essentially lost. The focus turned on how do we look at the community and planning ahead for recovery, and then what about the rest of the state in that region? How do we start planning to protect the other communities and see what we could do downstream in the river farther up north? Continuity of government, and it would be the same for business and industry, became one of the real keys. And it's basically how do you respond as a jurisdiction or as a business or industry when all your infrastructure is gone? I mean, most of your police cars are gone, your police station is still there, but it's boat access only, your fire stations are gone, most of your fire equipment is gone, your sewer system is down, your water system is down, and all your employees' homes have been affected. It makes it very difficult to try to respond to that. One of the things that we have found that is going to be critical, and we're really going to emphasize that, is the delegation of authority and a chain of command within the organization. And it has to be very clear who is in charge and what's the delegation of authority in these various positions. And we need to be at least 3 deep. How do you staff 24 hours a day? Because when you get into disasters like this, we were staffing 24 hours a day for about 45 days. And that becomes extremely difficult to do. We ended up bringing in a lot of outside resources to try to maintain that level of staffing. So you look back in your organizations and try and figure out how are you going to do that. It becomes very difficult, especially when all your infrastructure is gone. You have no city hall to operate out of. It's gone. It's underwater. All your plans, all your permitting systems, all your information is underwater. There is nothing that is left there. You basically got out of there and you got a pen in your hand and a piece of paper to start over with. So all your plans and how you're going to respond and all your contacts, that stuff is gone. It's out of the picture. Now you got to regroup and try to start all over again. Delegation of authority is really critical, is to determine who is in charge. So there is a single point of contact to a community or to a facility to try and identify that. And we've got to have, basically what we ended up establishing in East Grand Forks was basically a city manager style of government on an interim basis. And their style of government is everybody reports directly, each department head, to the city council. There's a president of the council and the mayor and the body of the council. Well, that type of a structure does not work very well for basic decision making in a disaster, because you need to be able to make decisions very frequently. The only way that that system works is if you leave the council in session 10 to 15 hours a day. So they're always there, that you can always go to them to get the authority to do what we need to do. We found out that that wasn't working. We were able to take one of the city staff members, and they basically appointed him as an interim emergency coordinator and gave him basically the position level of what a city manager would be, and empowered that individual to make a lot of decisions and keep the reconstruction of the infrastructure on track and keep that process moving. Staffing is really a critical issue when we look at a response. We got to be able to do it 24 hours a day. We've got to be 3 deep. And people in different divisions, whether it's the sewer and water or the fire department or the police department, there has to be a good line of succession, at least 3 deep. That the people are informed and they know what their roles and responsibilities are, and they can make decisions. One of the biggest keys that we've seen in many of the towns, employers that had empowered their employees to be able to make decisions responded the most effectively. Managers that micromanaged or required everything to be run through them at the time of the disaster were swamped, because their employees were trained and used to that system. They didn't think on their feet. Somebody else always had to think for them. And that's one lesson I would say that I would bring out to local units of government and the private industry, is your people need to be empowered. They need to know their parameters, and they need to be able to make decisions on their own. Because when you get devastated like that, everybody's got to come together and pick up the pieces and go. You can't have top-driven, this is exactly what we have to do each step of the way, because you can't do it. People got to be able to pick up the pieces and start moving forward. We ended up relocating City Hall, and it was probably one of the most positive things that came out of the flood. And now when we relocated City Hall, we relocated the staff and their families at the same time. We took the power of the sheriff and commandeered the Comfort Inn in East Grand Forks. And basically took everybody that was in the hotel and threw them out, took it over for the city, and brought all the city employees and their families and put them in there. And that was one of the best things that we did, because from that point on, and this was about the 4th day into the flood that we did this, we were able to sustain city staff, and the employees could start to now focus on what they needed to do to rebuild the community. And in this case up here, they are the gas company, they are the electric company, along with all the rest of your municipal services, including garbage. So they are it. And it was critical that we could get that core staff of employees together to start to plan on how we're going to do the recovery. And one of the keys that we found in our successes was we had to take care of their families. They had to know where their families were, that their families had a place to sleep, and they knew where their meals were going to come from. Without that, they couldn't focus on what the needs of the community were. And that is just human nature, and that's one of the critical elements in looking at business continuation and planning, is what happens when all your employees are affected. How do we take care of the employee, get their needs met, so now they can start to focus on the goals of the organization, to try to pull that together. So we found that to be one of the critical things. We brought in generators for the EOC, brought them in on trucks, hooked up basically the Comfort Inn as the EOC and City Hall, and a place for the employees to stay. Meals were brought in, provided for them in a lunchroom. There was 3 meals a day. They had running water. They dug up the water mains to the building, cut them, and we brought truckloads of water in and pressurized the system into the building from tanker trucks outside. The other end of the building, we dug up the sewer line and brought back trucks in and sucked the sewer out of the building. So it was basically self-sustained operation there for that particular facility, which was key in trying to reestablish the government and get things back moving again. The other evacuation that we had to contend with that was kind of unique and has really forced us to change our manner of thinking on evacuations is bring your pets with you. The pet evacuation becomes a critical issue about 4 or 5 days into an incident that they're still out there. And we've experienced this 2 or 3 times now. Nationally, it's been some very heated issues and other types of disasters. In that the norm is that we will basically go through and take the same measures to go in and get somebody's dog or cat as we would if it was a human being in there. from the outside pressures. You can't ignore the pets or the animals. You're going to, as a responder, end up going back in there to get them out. Political pressure will force you into doing that. We had a hard time with the community in that we wanted to try to affect this earlier into the flooding. We ended up, the flood broke loose basically Saturday morning. On Wednesday we started the evacuation for the animals. We wanted to do it on Monday. We had a plan in place and resources to do that, but the city was basically saying no, time out. We still have people that are out there that haven't come out yet. They're living on their second stories. They're still trying to fight the fight. They won't come out. And slowly they were coming out, so we constantly had a public safety rescue. There was always people that were out in the water that wouldn't come out. State of Minnesota, we don't have the power to forcibly evict somebody out of there. And we were doing rescues where when the water came in on the second floor, the people were finally throwing flags out the windows to flag down the helicopter saying we wanted to come out. And that was constantly drawing on our resources. So the community said, how do we focus on animals when we still have people that are out there? But the political pressure grew very quickly with a lot of the animal rights groups and those folks saying, you've got to get in there, what do you mean you're not doing anything? And we were able to affect the rescues that were in there, and I'd have to say that the Humane Society, the national chapter of the Humane Society, was a key player in that. We got the city to okay the rescue or evacuation of the animals as long as it didn't task any of the public safety resources that were on the site. The Humane Society, we brought them in, and it's a national, basically, search and rescue team for animals. They bring in their trained people, they have their trucks, they have portable kennels, they have their boats, they have helicopters, they got planes, they got it all. And they basically came in and managed that whole thing for us. And when the animals came out, the vets were there and took care of them. We had dogs on IVs and we had everything else going on. But it was really impressive to see the human side of that when somebody's Fluffy got brought out, they got linked up with its owner. And I mean, in some cases, they brought Fluffy out off the boat, put him into a kennel, they got checked out, got him some food and some water, put him on a helicopter and flew him 50 miles away to the owner and reunited him with the owner. I mean, and for a lot of those folks, those pets or those animals are just like children to them. And that's something that we have to take into account and to think about. But the Humane Society did a wonderful job in doing that. We basically ended up with 467 animals that were evacuated and reunited with their owners. And that is a task all unto itself, is to figure out where they are and what they are, and now who the owner is. And we had set up hotlines for people that had pets to come in, that they could call in and give us a description of the pet or where it was, because they weren't all in the same property. Not all of them had collars on them and ID tags, so it was kind of a zoo to do. It was mostly dogs and cats, but we had your typical birds and rodents, reptiles, rabbits, and a goldfish. And the one that was probably the most challenging to rescue was the goldfish, who probably thought he went to heaven, because he was in an area where the basement had flooded, but that had flooded from seepage water. And the gentleman that owned the goldfish was considerably attached to this particular animal. And we had at one point thought of going to the store and buying a goldfish for him and putting it in a jar and giving it to him. But about that point, we had a crew that went into their house to look to see where the goldfish was, and it was in the basement. And every now and then this little gold thing would come by the steps and go back out this way again. So it was in the basement, so we ended up feeding it for about 4 days till the water level got down low enough that we could get down there with a net and catch the goldfish and return it to the rightful owner. So sometimes you have to take those little things as challenges to see what you can do to go in there to help people and have a little fun at the same time. But it is a challenge when we say rodents and reptiles. I mean, we had spiders, we had snakes, we had rats, we had, you name it, it came out of there. And the biggest challenge on the snake, I think, was about a 6-foot boa constrictor that was loose in somebody's house to go in and get. And get it in a bag and get it out and get it to its rightful owner. But people are attached to those animals, and you need to plan on what to do with that. One of the things that we are focusing on in the state right now is a change in how we do evacuations. Now, when we evacuate people, we're going to insist you bring your pets with you. That if you have time, if it's something other than a structure fire where you have to immediately get out because there is no other time to escape or to get out, we're telling people to bring your pets with. The other key piece that we had in there is medications. How many people in here are on some type of prescription medication? Whether it be allergy or anything else. There's probably a few that are. How many know exactly what it is and what the prescription dose is? There was very few people that we evacuated that knew that or knew that information about their children, what medications they were on. And about 24 hours into it, we started to get calls from parents saying, my son is on anti-seizure medication or this or that, and they haven't had it for 24 hours. Really some critical medical issues. We ran into a big problem in that when we went to search the database to get that information out from the pharmaceutical areas, all 3 pharmacies are underwater. All the pharmacies on the other side of the river are underwater. All the data was inaccessible. If we had the jar or we knew the prescription, it was easy to go get it filled. We didn't have that in a lot of cases, and in many cases people had no clue what prescriptions they were on or what the dosage was. It was a yellow pill, I took it 3 times a day. We ended up setting up physicians on emergency hotlines that had to do over the phone diagnosis of what their problems were and call in their prescriptions to the closest pharmacy to wherever they were evacuated at and have them go pick them up. It became a major issue for a lot of folks that were out there, and it became kind of an intense time when you had things like anti-seizure medication and those kind of things that are out there that we were able to get through that okay. But our evacuation messages now are saying, bring your pets, bring your medications. You know, write a note in your wallet that says, this is what I'm on, so you have it with you. Bring your cash cards too, but be aware they might not work. Planning for the re-entry to the community was a real challenge, and trying to figure out how do we safely get people back into this community. As every day went on, the pressure built higher and higher from the evacuees, the people that had left the community, the victims. And I wanted to get back in. I wanted to see if there was something I could get out of my house yet. I wanted to see how bad the damage was. Pressure is higher and higher. We had still gas leaks that were in there because they couldn't get to where the shutoff valves were to isolate the gas. In some cases where we were able to shut the gas off, unfortunately we shut off emergency generators that were running at facilities because they were powered by natural gas. So when we lost the entire gas system, we lost some of the backup power that we had on some of the cell towers and other things that were out there that were helping to provide us communications. Electricity became a real heated issue. And as some people that were evacuated out of the town had some pumps that were still running, they had left, the water was up to basically the front door, but their basements were dry because they all have 2 or 3 sump pumps that were keeping up. And we needed to turn the power off to get the people back in because there's so much damage. It became a very political issue that went to a council meeting and for an official action on whether we were going to turn the power off or not. And the decision finally came that yes, they did turn the power off in the sections of town for the re-entry for people to come in to get their stuff. Unfortunately, that flooded quite a few more basements. There were a couple areas of town that weren't being flooded at all, but when we cut the power, and in order to re-energize, they had to go through and pull all the meters off and put blank plates in, and then come back and start to put temporary services on every house. That was the only way that we felt we could safely get power back into there. So the electricity got turned off, and it wasn't until we could get the electricians in there and put temporary services in that they could actually have electricity to start their sump pumps again. And that created a lot of anxiety among some folks that had dry basements until we did that. Keeping people out of town was very difficult. Trying to tell people it's not safe, you need to stay away. This water is full of sewage, it's full of fuel oil, it's full of everything you can imagine that's come up the river. And debris and stuff is scattered everywhere. It was a real challenge to maintain security and keep the people out until it was safe for them to come back in. And we had to do that through boat patrols and security checkpoints, enforcing curfews and those kind of things in order to try to maintain that. This is part of the patrols, just conservation officers and boats constantly patrolling. We brought airboats in and things from the DNR, so we had officers in town all the time to try to do that. It was amazing what we found when the water started to go down. We started to realize a lot of the depth and scope of some of our problems. Debris management was just a part of those problems. But we had structures that were damaged, we had debris that was everywhere, whether it was a barrel of who knows what it was to propane tanks, 20,000 gallon propane tanks sitting out in the middle of the street. I mean, these things just floated up and they're gone. We don't know where that one particular tank came from. It happened to be empty at the time that we found it, but somewhere along its travels it emptied itself out along the way when it broke loose. So there's a lot of things. One of the things that we did not have, that I was surprised we did not have underground fuel tanks coming out of the ground. We were expecting to see a lot more of that. We didn't have it, and we suspect because of the way the water came up is that there was enough hydraulic pressure to keep the tanks in. And with the frozen ground and stuff, and then the way that it receded, we just didn't run into that particular issue there. We were really surprised. We had a lot of problem with fuel oil in houses, home heating oil tanks, all those, the fuel oil came out, so a lot of these basements are coated with fuel oil on the inside, up and down them. So as the water went down, it basically coated the walls with fuel oil inside the structures. When people got back into town, the first thing they did is start throwing everything out of their house. Natural instinct. I would probably do the exact same thing. It started to create a nightmare in trying to separate this debris. We were able to recognize that right away and put a plan in place on debris management that said, and we went and put posters on everybody's house and said, when you take it out of the house, we had ended up with 5 or 6 categories of materials, and the appliances go in one pile, sheetrock and building materials in another, furniture in another pile, all just separating the stuff out, so when we did the collection, it was already segregated for us. Because once they start throwing stuff into a pile, they'll never go back in and re-separate it for you. So you got to be right on the get-go with that when they did that. Not only do we have the cleanup of the debris, but now we've got the cleanup of all the dike material that was laid in place down some of the streets, all the sandbag material that had gone on for about 2 months worth of work. Now all needs to be hauled back out of there. And that's a huge issue. It's still going on today. We brought in all the local contractors they could hire. FEMA brought in national contractors from around the country to help support and try and manage that debris and clean up and get rid of it. You folks are probably all very familiar with government regulations and processes. I'd say that we have one definite success story of state government here. We were able to open a temporary landfill and have a permit for it in less than 24 hours. With monitoring wells and everything, all the plans, everything in place, everything with state approvals, federal approvals, and a landfill open. People came together to solve the problems that we had, and they were able to solve them correctly, not haphazardly. One of the things that we ran into, and this picture kind of shows it, is we ended up bringing backhoes in because these dikes that were all made, when the water went down, it was now trapped in the water. So you end up bringing big backhoes in, come down the streets and opening these things back up to let the water back out of the town. And then the task of coming back again now and picking up all that material. Anything that was underwater basically had between 1 and 1.5 inches of mud on it. Whether it was the front lawn or your main floor of your house or your basement, everything was covered with mud that was underneath the floodwaters. And the stench was bad. It did not smell good in that particular area. This would be a typical afternoon of somebody coming in for 4 or 5 hours and working on your house. That's what was put outside. You'd pick that up and 4 hours later, it'd look like you never went down the street again. And day after day after day, for miles of streets, that's what it was. From about a little over 2,000 homes, that was the norm. You look down the street, it was just piles of debris, and there was clamshells and backhoes and trucks just constantly hauling the stuff out. And you'd clear a street and you'd come back in the afternoon and you'd swear you never were down the street again. And the pressure kept building that they weren't hauling debris out, that they weren't hauling it out for the media. They were clearing it, but in just a few hours it was filled back up again. So it was a constant issue of debris management and moving that stuff. We found out early separation was the key, and to start to split it into basic categories. Your hazardous materials, we had people that came in and dealt with all the hazardous materials. We had different folks do the appliances, tires, and all this stuff had to be segregated when it went into the landfills. It had to go into different sections of the landfill and all this kind of stuff in order to do that. We found public information to be incredibly challenging. We basically found that one of the areas that we could greatly improve upon is information to the victims, the people that were removed. We were basically inundated by national media. When you get the CNNs and the NBCs and everybody else out there along with the local media, they draw and demand a whole lot of attention, and unfortunately it delayed us in getting information to the victims of the people that were in shelters. We just couldn't staff it enough to do that. We recognize that now and have made that a real high priority for any type of a disaster that we go into again, is that we have this kind of political public information that the media wants, but we have information we need to get to people that are in the shelters. It says, how bad is it in my town? When do I get back in? And that was a piece that we weren't able to get really in place until about 8 days into the flood. And we feel bad that we weren't able to get that information to the victims, which came out in their frustration in some of the town meetings that we started to deal with. We had a lot of VIPs that came through, and there was a circus of them. And it's about the best way I could establish it, in that when they come into town, basically day-to-day operations stop. We ended up finally at one point taking the department heads and separating them from the rest of the city government and establishing our work plan for how we're going to recover from the disaster to get the infrastructure back. We had the president come through, we had the vice president come through, we get the director of FEMA coming through, James Lee Witt, and all the series of politicians that come through. And every time they want to meet with the local officials, they were canceling council meetings so they could meet with these folks. And it wasn't really until afterwards that I had probably realized the importance of this function. That if they wouldn't have been there and they wouldn't have been met with and talked to, we probably wouldn't have got the 100% funding that we got from FEMA. Normally it's a 75%, 25%, 25% to the state, and that is generally passed with the state taking 15%, 10% to the local. If you take that 25% of $840 million right now, that's a huge impact. With the VIPs that came through and the trips that the mayors made to Washington, they were able to get that 100% funding and additional funding for reconstruction and buyouts. So dealing with the VIPs became a challenge because they came in, and depending on who was coming in, when the president comes in, your air operation shut down. It's a whole new Secret Service comes into town, and they take care and control of the airspace. That's when the fire started to break out. We had problems with trying to get helicopters in the air while the president's doing a flyover, and all kinds of coordination issues that were challenging throughout the event. The issue of reconstruction or not became a real big issue for the code folks. And at the city now I had to come up and say either you can rebuild or you can't rebuild. And with the areas in the floodplain, in order to stay in the program to get FEMA reimbursements, you've got to enforce the regulations of the floodplain. And it became very difficult to say that now up to 40% of your housing stock in your community is gone because of where it's located and that it was flooded. And in order to rebuild that, it had to be put in a part of town that had never flooded before. And that became a challenge. Now you're literally moving the town. In the city of Ada, the hospital was totally destroyed. The hospital has now got to be relocated. They won't allow them to build it any closer than about 5 miles from town. So now, basically the hospital is going to move, and eventually probably the whole town will move, and all the infrastructure is got to be put out there. Just a tremendous cost associated with a lot of those particular activities. Temporary housing issues became a big problem. You have an apartment building, you have a desire need for housing, the first floor is trashed on it, are you going to let people live on second and third floors? Yeah, we ended up doing that. It was there on the street. Trying to do the best we could for fire protection and electricity and doing things that we could do to get people back into some sort of reasonable living quarters while restoration was being made. There was RV trailers that were brought in and actually parked at people's houses that didn't have a lot of damage, that just their basements were damaged so they could live in the trailer while they were restoring their house. One of the big problems you get in flooded houses is the bacteria and mold that starts to grow in these houses, and you can't live in them. So you get them all stripped out and cleaned out and disinfected. So that became a real health concern that is there. Then the other thing that we get into is the 90-day housing, which is basically the trailers coming in, the RV type trailers, and then mobile homes. And currently there's about 415 mobile homes that are permanently in that city, or up to 18 months they'll be there. And we had to go in and put streets in, and sewer and water and electric and all that in order to support that particular function there, just to give some type of housing. We're still waiting to see, the jury's out yet on how good that housing is going to be, considering that FEMA's generally used to hurricanes and warm climate zones for dealing with those issues. And we kept telling them, you know, it gets 50 below in East Grand Forks and the wind blows. And they assured us that nothing would freeze in those trailers, and nobody is there. The local people really don't believe that yet. So I think we're into a challenging winter in the particular areas where those have been installed. The state's role is really the coordination with the National Guard. The National Guard is activated through the governor's executive order and is under control of the governor, and that authority is delegated to emergency management. We had the State Emergency Operations Center that was up and functioning in St. Paul. We ran into a challenge that we found out that our EOC that we would generally use was totally inadequate to handle the magnitude of this disaster. And about 5 days into the major part of the flooding, we had to move our EOC to another building. And we ended up moving it to the 5th floor of the Veteran Service Building, which meant all the phone lines and communications and computer data lines and all that stuff. But we were able to do it in about 21 hours. Then we had regional program coordinators that were out there. And then we had our, what we call our MAC. It's a Multi-Agency Coordination Center. It's a large motorhome that was deployed in East Grand Forks for about 6 weeks. And that was a focal point for coordination of state resources. Kind of brought our own office in there so we wouldn't pass on to the local infrastructure. The National Guard did a wonderful job, and they basically did anything that we asked them to do, above and beyond the call of duty. Just a tremendous number of resources that were deployed out there. It was the largest deployment in the state's history in use of the National Guard, with 3,000 personnel deployed on active duty, 28,000 what they call their man days. That's a lot of staff time, but it does come with a price tag. Their estimated cost is about $8 million, and they figured out go up another $1 to $2 million with the maintenance on all their trucks. Everything that was out there was underwater, in water, and they're still in the process of taking it all apart, changing all the fluids, and putting everything back together again. But they were a tremendous asset that was used throughout the state. State EOC, we had the activation and move. We have basically our staffing of operations, logistics, planning, finance administration, computer support and technology, and volunteer coordination. That volunteer hotline you heard, that was being staffed through our state EOC and trying to coordinate people that wanted to volunteer time or resources or donated goods and bring that into the state. In kind of a summary of the function of an EOC, which is the Emergency Operations Center, we take a look at the command. This is one of these is basically an event going on out there in the field, and we have the city EOC like Ada and Hendrum and Halstead and Shelley, and they were going back to their respective county EOCs who were tapping back into the state EOC. And the state EOC was then tapping into FEMA Region 5 EOC out of Chicago for equipment, resources, and those type of activities. At any point in time through this disaster, we had 57 counties with their EOCs activated coming back to the state EOC, looking for resources. And the way the state responds is basically, if you can't handle it in your own community, you have no resources to do that, you have to go to the county. If the county can no longer find the resources to provide for you, if they can't hire somebody to provide it or find a contractor to do it, then they can tap into the state. And that's where the state comes in, and we had not only National Guard, but DOT, DNR, a lot of folks involved in trucking sandbags, actually from the metro area, up to some of these towns to protect them. It got to crunch time that we could not, up in the northern part of the state, fill sandbags fast enough to deploy them. We ended up filling them in the cities where we had the staff of people to do that, load them on trucks, and trucking filled sandbags up to the northern part of the state. And that's what saved a lot of the smaller towns up there, because once East Grand Forks was lost, the convoy of sandbags that was being routed there was redirected all the way up the border to the Canadian border and was deployed to protect a lot of those communities. It's a shot of our coordination center. We had stationed at East Grand Forks and had phone lines dropped in so that we could coordinate with our overhead team all the state agency support and coordinate with the National Guard there without putting any additional pressure on the local authorities. We basically looked at our incident management system. You know, when we talk about command, we talk about an incident commander that is basically in charge of the entire event of the disaster, including public information and safety, linking back into the EOC, and the Emergency Operations Center is a whole nother structure that is there to look at the bigger picture of it, and then they tier up to other types of events or other tiers of government. And the biggest thanks that came out of a lot of this is the volunteers that came out. From the people in the metro areas and people in their own communities that came out. It was a tremendous outpouring of physical labor and people coming out to do work, not only to help fight the flood, but the cleanup effort afterwards. And that's really where the volunteers showed through. I think the biggest is in the cleanup activity afterwards, because people are exhausted and they're emotionally drained after losing everything that they have. And now they got this huge task of trying to clean their house out and salvage materials. And to truck volunteers into there to work was a tremendous asset. It also created problems in trying to find housing, and that there was no housing stock available there. And we ended up going into other towns and setting up gymnasiums and churches and schools to provide that housing capability. That's kind of a nutshell, the response up in that particular area and some of the effects of the flooding. Are there any questions or comments that anybody has?
In one of the video, the city building official come along and give permission for the people to start dismantling, and permission maybe to rebuild. Then FEMA would come along and say, no, you can't do this. And the people were kind of whipsawed and really not knowing, did any of that happen up there in the Forks also?
Yeah, it did. It took a little while for us to get everybody on the same page, and that we had all the right inspectors going through and doing things the way they were supposed to do. One of the things that it took a little while to fix, but FEMA hires a lot of contract people to come in and do work. And when you're contracted to FEMA, you follow the rule book. Well, the people would come to the house and, you know, they need to inspect the flood damage, which includes the basement, and the basement's underwater. But they wouldn't issue a check or make an assessment saying, well, we have to wait till you pump the basement out before we can come back and make that assessment. Well, it took about a week, and that was part of the problem. We have the basements collapsing because people were trying to pump them out because FEMA was telling them they had to pump them out so they could inspect them. And we got the FEMA inspector that said, you know, if it's full of water up to the top of the steps, everything in the basement's gone. They just have a flat formula for water heater, furnace. You know, those are the only types of things that they cover anyhow. You know, why do we have to pump the basement out so you can come back and look? And in some cases, they had basements that had collapsed, and they said, well, you have to get all the debris out of there so we can do the inspection on it first. And it was kind of like, well, time out, guys. Basement shot, you only have X amount of reimbursement anyhow. We just total out that area of the house and let's move on. And we were able to get that group pulled together to do that. We ended up bringing in a lot of engineers, structural engineers, and building and codes people from around the state to come in and support the local building official, Jerry Skyber, in their response in trying to do all that stuff out there. Because there was a tremendous amount of duplication of effort that had initially started, and then we got a system together to share that when the FEMA inspector went through, so they'd share that data with the city, so we didn't have to have another city inspector to do the damage assessment. We had assessors that had to come through for tax purposes and do a complete assessment to lower the property taxes on all the houses that were damaged. And that whole mechanism, they brought people, assessors in from all over the state and did a big